Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I am an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I will have a conversation with my dear friend Tren. Hello, Tren.
Hi everybody, hi Aran. This is Chen. I'm a medieval historian. I'm thrilled to further our discussion today. Evolutionary psychology. Yeah.
Yes, we are continuing our critique of evolutionary psychology based on David Buehler's book, Adapting Minds. We discussed the concept of plasticity in the last two episodes, and we tried to show that Buehler has a rather convincing argument to say that number one, plasticity is the name of the game for adaptation of an intelligent social mammal like us, and no predetermined planning is sufficient to make sense of the complex decision making and the arms race of adaptation that exists in uh, in an animal like Homo sapiens. And we also try to show that arguing for plasticity is by no means uh, supporting some form of a social constructionist or culturally relativist position. It's not by any means a matter of a dichotomy between evolutionary psychologist position and like a blank slate position. Plasticity, as Bueller understands it, offers a third option that neither falls into the naivete of social constructionists that just shrug off the quote unquote natural side of humanity and claim the supremacy of the culture, nor it gives in to the bullying efforts of evolutionary psychologists in reducing all the cultural, broadly understood cultural activities into superficial variations. It opens room for a transformative layer of environment without uh, getting rid of the uh, significant system of constraints that are not necessarily up for negotiation by any environment on planet Earth. Today, what we're going to do is that we're kind of entering the last phase of discussing Bueller's criticism, and at this stage, we want to talk about the relationship between cultural universals and psychological universals. And once we set the ground there, we are ready to see the kind of final blow that Bueller thinks he strikes at evolutionary psychology, which is directly targeting the concept of human nature. Once we understand, in other words, that the way that evolutionary psychologists want to tie cultural universals with psychological universals is not tenable, we have all we needed to understand why evolutionary psychologists' understanding of the concept of human nature is ultimately not defensible. Trent, anything to add to that introduction?
No, I think you did a great job. We should
Right.
just carry on and see how.
I love to hear that all the time. Okay, so cultural universals, psychological universals. These terms are going to become important in our critical remarks as well. So just taking a moment to understand what they mean is very important. Um, According to Bueller, there are like three claims that are made by the evolutionary psychologists in terms of like universals. Number one, cultural universals exist. Number two, cultural universals exist because of psychological universals. And number three, psychological universals are adaptations. Okay, so let's stay with the first one for a second. Cultural universals exist. What does that mean? That means that there are certain things, traits, capacities, whatever you want to call them, that exists in every human culture that we have studied. Okay. Now, the way this works is a little bit tricky because it's not saying that there is something is a cultural universal is not to say that every single human being possesses that trait, right? So it's not that there is like something that one like in this sense, cultural universal is not about a property that every single human being must possess. It's not what a cultural universal is. Cultural universal is a characteristic, a trait that every human culture possesses. Okay. Um, Example could be cooking, right? That cooking exists, but not every individual is a chef, right? There could be human beings that not only they're not chefs, but that they cannot cook at all. And even like think about something even more kind of a little bolder that might be something that someone like Kant or Hegel would say that to say reason is a cultural universal is not to say that there are no people without like severe mental disabilities that would like disqualify them for like what we usually understand as reasoning. That just means that reason exists in every culture, right? Um, Now, of course, saying that reason exists in every culture is a far more controversial concept than saying cooking exists in every culture, just because perhaps the ambiguity that exists with the term reason exists in a culture is more clear than the ambiguity that makes it exist in saying that cooking exists. And how much of this is just about like another sneaky problem with universals in general, that's something that will come up later on in our conversations. But in any case, the point that is important here is that to say cultural universal exists is not to say that every human being has a certain property. It's to say that every human culture has a property. So notice how the unit has been decided here. That's going to become important later on. Now, cultural universals could exist for a number of reasons, but evolutionary psychology has a very specific story. Cultural universals exist because of psychological universals. It's not an accident that we both have cultural universals and psychological universals, evolutionary psychologists would say. In fact, they're not parallels, they're not two separate things. Cultural universals are just manifestations of psychological universals. That's all there is. And lastly, psychological universals are adaptations, meaning that psychological universals are not, say, genetic drifts to fixation in small populations and then propagation of that into larger populations. They are adaptations. And we have talked about like what we mean by adaptations or what evolutionary biologists mean by adaptations in the past episodes. So I'm not going to repeat that here. The idea then is that there is a non-random relationship between psychological universals and cultural universals, and cultural universals are matter of factually existent across human populations. Trent, anything to add to these claims?
Yes. Something I think is not controversial, but is implicit here is an important agreement between Buller and those persons that he criticizes. Not just cultural universals that exist, but also those pan-human similarities that are a cultural dimension of human species. So they're cultural dimension of a single species, therefore they are the same despite the differences in their evolution trajectory or environments. I think this will come up later on in our critical remarks when we talk about the role of culture in human evolution for Buller in total. But I just want to clarify that, and we can just proceed to see how Buller tears down that rigid association between cultural and psychological universals.
Yes, and that's exactly how we get there because like the important thing is that Buehler agrees that cultural universals exist. What he doesn't agree is that cultural universals exist because of psychological universals, and psychological universals are adaptations. How and why, that's what we're going to talk about. Now, so there are a number of issues that Buehler has with tying cultural and psychological universals. The first one we have called the fallacy of Gray's anatomy. The issue here is that it is almost a universal feature of at least Cosmides and Tooby's work that I have dealt with to mention human anatomy and like this kind of like a Gray's anatomy as the collection of anatomical structure of human beings, right? As some sort of a starting point, a metaphorical point of like what they are after, right? So basically, the idea is that because we can like now see that by analysis of human anatomy, we were able to kind of like compile, very neat encyclopedic knowledge of what is it to be anatomically a human being. Um, we can do the exact same thing with our psychological side. Why? Because as much as the body is a matter of natural selection, the psychological aspects are a matter of natural selection. But it's not that our psyche, there is no like weird metaphysical claim that the psyche has its own like story in a rather Kantian way. It is just like its own like realm. And this is like the biological realm. No, no, no. Everything is a biological realm. There's no non-natural thing in that sense. And the idea there is that, of course, like, my kidney and Trent's kidney are not exactly the same. Like maybe if you just go and like scan them, there are just minor idiosyncrasies. But in terms of like the general structure of them, they're going to be the same thing. In other words, variations are just superficial variations. It's not something that we need to really pay attention to. What matters is the universality. Now, why is there a problem to think that the point about anatomy, universal anatomy, is applicable to universal psychology? Okay, well, like, what is the problem of like doing that? Well, the problem of doing that is number one, the reason that our anatomy is rather uniform, um, it has a very, very important cause. And that cause is in the broad um, scope of things, the environment, the landscape that we have been part of in the, in a basic natural sense of the word, um, hasn't changed, right? It's not like that we are suddenly thrown in Mars with a completely different chemical component in the air, or we are now suddenly kind of thrown under the water. Now we have to kind of like do something quite different, or like there is a species of human, like there is like a subcategory of human beings that are just like live underwater, and their lungs is just like a completely different thing, but somehow we still can like reproduce together. Just there is no such a massive difference. Of course, like someone living in the middle of Sahara Desert versus someone living in the Arctic, there are meaningful differences between these two places, but the difference is not enough to put a pressure, evolutionary pressure on us to have a completely new, subcategory of kidneys, right? It's the pressure is not enough that, of course there are like areas in the world and spaces in the world that the quality of weather is very different, right? Like it could be like even like the altitude, right? How much oxygen a lung can endure. But it's not in the greater scope of things that is not so intense that like our anatomy is like varied. But that doesn't tell us anything about the psychological layer of us. Because remember the whole point about the arms race of adaptations. The point about social intelligent animals like us is that our main selective pressure is not environment anymore, but it is other members of our species. And that is a very dynamic space, right? Compared to the transformation of the earth, insofar as, let's say, the chemicals in the atmosphere, so much has changed and so much actively changes within a human society. Within the same human society, even with a lot of like a stability of like some structures, all sorts of other psychological forces come into play that create new selective pressures for a subcategory of a population, right? We have used this example of like mating and the problem of finding high status males. The problem shows itself here. The Even with that kind of accepting that is a fact, that females are always looking for higher status males, the game that is being played for that resource, quote unquote, is a game of unpredictable, to a degree unpredictable, psychological warfare, and sometimes very kind of physical warfare that has psychological impacts. So let's say, even like let's think about it this way, even to kind of make this point clear. Trent mentioned the issue of the fictional example of a tribe, a hunter-gatherer tribe, say that there are people with different size of tools, like let's say hammers, males with different size of tools. Now, let's say for whatever reason we decide that the bigger the hammer, the higher the status of that male. And let's forget about what Trent mentioned about like the possible environmental changes that might jeopardize that point completely. Even if that's absolutely fixed, the competition between females to get the man with the biggest hammer is the arm race of adaptation, right? Because you might say that the way to attract the man with the biggest hammer is to have the whatever, just biggest boob, like whatever, like some sort of a physical aspect. But the other females that are competing for that could do all sorts of things to, for instance, change the mind of the man with the biggest hammer in the tribe, that spreading rumors that like whoever sleeps with woman with bigger boobs is gonna die in a year. Let's say they can say that like there is a prophecy that has just said that this is like this person is actually devilish and should be burnt. Like that creates a completely new chaotic moment in that little society, even if everything else is just like exactly the same, right? If like the men with the biggest like tools are convinced that another attribute is the marker of like, you know, uh, reproductive health, and new forms of cheating, new forms of convincing, new forms of propaganda, new forms of, you know, religions, new forms of um, even conspiracies against those people could emerge within a society. That's very important. Because in all of this, not only we said that the environment is the same, the anatomy is the same, we even said it's a very kind of a perceptible, like even the high status is extremely clear of what it is. And then we see how that simple game can turn into a very complex game very soon. No stability. If we're looking for stability in the way that it is the chemical components in that atmosphere, there is no such a thing in the psychological term, and that's important. This is a fallacy. Just because our anatomical structure is rather uniform, that doesn't mean that there is there that we can infer that about our psychological capacities. And the second point is the uniformity of anatomy itself is a myth, in the sense that, like, whatever, just as one example, approximately 1 in every 1,500 infants is born with ambiguous genitalia, which do not allow the assignment of a sex. Like, what should we do with that? Right? It's another like kind of trick that, of course, if you get rid of all the exceptions, you get uniformity. If you have a strategy of saying that anything that doesn't match the dominant majority structure can be, neglected, then of course you will have a uniform handbook. Like, that's not because you found uniformity, that's because you assumed uniformity. And this is going to be related to the point about the concept of norm, which we're going to get into. But Trent, do you have anything to add to what I've said so far?
Not new content. I just probably rephrase the very long discourse he gave is there are crucial differences, I think, that Bueller tries to highlight between the human anatomy and the human psychology. First is perhaps that the speed or the length or temporal range of the feedback loop. For instance, the way human beings obtain like a pair of lungs to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide, it takes much, much longer than a lot of so-called psychological habits that we developed, and that temporal frames difference absolutely matters. Second is how directly the human evolution, like acquired a certain new capacity, could directly change the whole dynamic of this environment that human beings dwell. For instance, let's talk about the atmosphere. Human beings are rather insignificant, I mean, until industrial revolution, participant in the whole equilibrium of like the gas composition and as well as the temperature, because there are so many other species doing it, and we're all exchanging air using lungs, something like that. And plants were part of the whole deal. But if we are looking into social life, as you mentioned here, it becomes very different. Human beings become dominant players that are in this social environment of other human beings. So that and the way they receive input and react, and their react turn into output in the environment is a way more rapid process compared to like how human beings lungs evolve. So just a little bit of clarification of or regurgitation of what we just said. Yes.
Yes. Very good. I think now we kind of like take like before getting to the problem of norm. I think there is something else that's a different kind of dimension here that I think is also very very interesting. It gets related to the everything, not everything, but I think most of these points get into the issue of frequency, and I think that's a very interesting kind of a problem to deal with. Because the second problem that Buehler finds with evolutionary psychologists connecting cultural universals with psychological universals is how they conflate average with universality, right? Um, and I think this is very interesting on so many different layers. Um, Buehler writes that these survey results that we have that like show that on average men prefer young women, women prefer resourceful men. What they show is not that particular preferences are psychological universals, but that particular average preferences are cultural universals. That might sound like kind of like an insignificant point. Like, who cares? Like, we're once we're talking about cultural universals, we're already kind of like thinking about, the cooking chef thing. Like, it's not that every single individual think that way. We still seem to be that we are talking about average, right? But there is something very important that gets lost in the game of average, because in like the analogy that Bueller makes, I think it is going to be it is going to be important that like the fallacy here is that just because the average of human height is 5 feet 8, that means that um, that's just like the inferring from that um, uh, inferring from the average height that every human being is 5 feet 8, right? There's like, to say that the average is indicating something about every human individual. Now, here I think there is there's an ambiguity that I think is important, and perhaps we will mention that in the critical remarks as well, because I think this is not necessarily what evolutionary psychologists say, right? They're not saying that every human being is the average, right? They're saying that the average is a cultural universal, or just the average shows what the cultural universal is. So this analogy may not really be to do justice with what evolutionary psychologists would say. What does justice, I think, is going back to the hawk dove game, and I think that would really show us like what is missing. So remember that the hawk dove game is uh, telling us that like imagine a game in which we have two strategies. The hawkish strategy, the dovish strategy. The hawkish strategy is the type of strategy that always goes for competitions and always goes for like attacking competitors to get to a resource. Okay, the dovish strategy is a conservative strategy, meaning that it consists of kind of a defensive mode. You don't get involved, you will protect yourself from injuries. Now, if we kind of like run the program, quote unquote, of like these strategies with different cost benefit analysis just as givens, what we see is that if you just throw random numbers of hawks and random number of doves, um, we see that if we have a population of like 90% doves and 10% hawks, what happens is that hawks are going to expand, right? Hawks could expand in two ways, which is rather insignificant for our purposes, but just like as a pointer. One, as like, being able to propagate more, so their genes are more present in the population, or by some doves adopting the hawkish strategy. Because if you have a lot of doves, the hawks will attack the kind of rather passive doves and to get the resources from them, and then that will be it. The problem though is that if you start like having a society that has like 90% hawks, then there are going to be so many conflicts and so many injuries. And injuries means being reproductively unsuccessful. If you get into every fight for every piece of food that is available, the chances are that you're going to lose those fights and you're going to get injured and you're going to die, right? So in that kind of a game, say we get to a kind of a stable frequency ratio, 75% hawkish, 25% dovish. Again, this could mean 75% of the people will always be hawkish, and so 25% of people are always dovish, or it could mean that the whole population, 75% of the time they adopt the hawkish strategy, and so 25% of the time they adopt the dovish strategy. Now, in a society that 75% of individuals are hawkish and 25% of individuals are dovish, you can do a survey, right? You can do an analysis and get to a number that it is very skewed towards hawkish, being hawkish, right? You can calculate the average number there, right? Like just like it's gonna be much closer to hawkishness, right? Now, from that, we can say the average is more hawkish. The average individual in that society is very likely hawkish. Right? Even we could say that the probability of being hawkish is much higher than being dovish. Okay? But notice what this story doesn't tell us. This doesn't tell us what is the relationship between the majority number and the minority number, right? Because the minority number could be just, maladaptation. They're just like stupid. Like they're just like, you will get like a number of people who are just stupid. That's just like a random thing that might happen. But recall, that is not the story that we have with the existence of 25% of dovish. They're not 25% based on some insignificant maladaptive variation. They are there precisely because the selection is frequency dependent in this case. Okay. Now, the point then is that, like, think about far more like skewed numbers as well. Let's say like 98% of individuals within a society do not show any psychopathic tendencies, and 2% show psychopathic tendencies. Okay. Now we do the survey and we see that an absolute dominant like number shows that human beings are non-psychopathic, right? That does not tell us that psychopathy is not a cultural universal, right? Just because it doesn't show up in the average, it doesn't mean that the cultural universal is that we are non-psychopathic. Because that frequency distribution could be the direct result of selective pressures that is sensitive to frequency. You see, so the doves aren't abnormal hawks. They're selected to be doves. That's a fundamentally different understanding of what is the scenario. If we are obsessed with averages, we make assumptions based on, or we make statements based on average behavior, and we assume that's the cultural universal. This other thing that is not that is not a cultural universal. It's just an anomaly. Not the case. Not the case in important cases, right? And this is also kind of a methodological problem, right? Because I think Buehler is suggesting that by not understanding the significance of this, evolutionary psychologists will always have a pathological relationship with minority numbers. because they all want to just kind of say that, oh, that doesn't matter. In average, men prefer young women. Maybe that's true. Maybe we can show that men prefer young women on average. But the fact that, like, whatever, 7% of men prefer much older women doesn't mean that it's not a cultural universal. That is not a malfunctioning psychological mechanism. That could be very similar to the hawk dove problem. Sure.
Yes, I think on top of what you said, there's also a problem, a methodological problem of back engineering that those evolutionary psychology, they send a survey, they do observation, they compute something called assessment, the statistic model of cultural traits among different human groups. And if such distribution converge on a certain ratio or like whatever pattern, then there's a psychological mechanism to account for this, the cultural convergence, despite differences in other area. But that confuses that just assumes that this not necessarily on surface level agreement of cultural pattern or traits that has one single psychological mechanism to account for, but they might come from different angles. For instance, the men prefer young women in culture A is because of like mate selecting problem, but in culture B is more about like avoiding of danger, say. But they created the same result. But this they homogenized the whole possible a whole range of possible sources of this distribution and take the representation, the convergence in final output the representation as the analogous similarity or structure parallel in the deeper level. I think that's his criticism about is because the way they design that research methodology, because the psychological mechanism, you cannot just go and observe directly. You're using certain media of certain means of mediation, certain symbolic tools to infer, and there's no robust mechanism to ensure the representing mechanism you used is similarly positioned in the evolutionary trajectory or strategy in each population. That's why you have the second line that why it's not helpful to take the average height of individual members of society as the norm or the cultural universal for human beings in general. I think that's an additional point, which is not. I don't think David Bueller is stupid in the sense of mistaking evolutionary psychology. Say we're not talking about the output should be the same or average. I think he's pointing on something more implicit here. Yes.
I see. That's a very interesting point. So like it's not so much about the like that every individual is so and so based on the average, but kind of like the back engineering of the mechanism behind, like just kind of like connecting that, creating that kind of a causal link.
Right.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Very good. Okay, now this whole story about like these 2 points, the fallacy of Gray's anatomy and conflating of human average with human universality, kind of pushes Bueller to provide alternative etiology for cultural universals. Because remember that Bueller thinks cultural universals exist, right? And he thinks that if they exist, there should be a causal story of why they exist. Now, these cultural universals, according to evolutionary psychologists, are about psychological universals, and the psychological universals are about adaptations. Right? But Bueller doesn't agree with that at all. And the first reason why he doesn't agree with that is what we talked about, frequency dependent selection. if selection can be about a certain distribution instead of a single psychological trait, when we speak of psychological universal, what exactly are we talking about? Because if we say that there is a psychological universal that determines my mating strategy, it seems like that I am saying that as an individual, I have that psychological mechanism, right? So remember, I think this is important that for evolutionary psychologists, there is the point of variation exists amongst individuals. Individuals are unique, but the variations are either like kind of functionally the same or like superficial or like very coordinated and kind of as if they are like running on different programs. Okay, now when we think about those differences, the way that we are framing those is that the psychological mechanism in those people are the same, but their manifest behavior are going to be different because let's say they're in different like hierarchical positions. Okay, like example, the psychological mechanism that make the dating strategy of a woman to be more for like you know just kind of like different like a variety of sexual partners versus like kind of a long-term reproductive safety, according to evolution psychologists, has something to do with like the investing or non-investing father experience, right? Um, okay, so what does this tell us? That is telling us that the mechanism is ultimately the same, but the mechanism could could if you give the mechanism A, it will give you B. If you give it C, it will give you D. But the mechanism is the same, the function is the same, it's just the input is different, right? But the frequency dependent selection is not saying that, or at least not necessarily, right? Because the frequency dependent selection could very well happen at the psychological mechanism level. Like maybe it was a selective thing that some people have a radically different psychological mechanism than others, right? Let's say in pursuing mating or in their relationship with danger, right? So, an extremely, I remember this short documentary that I saw about a very famous rock climber that just did like unprotected rock climbing in nature and in Yosemite and places like that, and just extreme activity, very sophisticated rocks. And there was a point in that documentary that they did a brain scan, and in the brain scan, it became clear that like the part of the brain that is responsible for regulating fear it's just like it is working differently for him. In other words, he doesn't just escape. It's not that he has worked on himself to overcome, some like existential fear. That part is not just activated. Okay. Now, what is that? Like, what is that in this whole story? What is that person? An anomaly? Maybe. Maybe a frequency dependent selection on a psychological mechanism to determine how much we're afraid of things. Maybe you need like 3% of the population to just not be afraid of anything. Maybe that is selected. Like, how did we infer? How do we distinguish between maladaptation and frequency dependent selection? That is, I think, the core of what Builder is mentioning here. Note that he's not giving us, a specific thing about, here are the options, here are the other like examples. Although I think he points at some, but he thinks that this kind of like morphs that evolutionary psychology only recognizes at the level of sex, um, may not be like that. We may have coordinated different configurations um, at the psychological level as a matter of selection and not as a matter of anomaly. Okay, and I think that's a very important point because it also shows like how elusive data collection could be because you have the data of like only 1% of human beings are so and so, but what that means is not at all clear. Just like it's not at all clear that saying that 1% of bees in a hive are queens is not clear of like what that means, right? Being minority doesn't mean that you are a maladaptation or you can be excluded from the story of what it means to be a universal. Um, Two, the point about transfer of traits um, could be about epidemiological transfer of traits, right? That we should look into a concept like cultural homology, meaning that different cultures coming from a single culture. Now, let's say uh, for absolutely unrelated reasons to any selective pressure, and for contingent state of affairs, a culture decided that they need to have like a story about like cosmos, right? Let's say they were bored, like just like it could be any number of reasons. Um, Now that cosmic story became a cultural element in that specific culture. But let's say that culture started to split, and then we had two splits, and then we had like 4 and an 8 and like 16 and whatever, and like so many cultures came out of that specific culture, right? Now all of those cultures kept that point about the cosmic story. Now, one of them went closer to the river, and they kind of like, changed the story a little bit, right? Some of them like faced a hurricane, and then like they added another like layer to the story, right? Now we got to the point that like all major cultural like populations in humanity has like a myth for creation. Okay, what is that? Is that like a psychological adaptation? Well, it doesn't need to be. It could be just every culture just like hand that down to the next culture because they were all part of the same culture that happened to decide to have that kind of a story, right? There is no necessity from an evolutionary perspective, although importantly enough, that might be a very central thing in kind of looking back at humanity and see what kind of an impact it has had on humanity. No problem with that. But just because it is universal doesn't mean that it is a psychological adaptation. It could be um, because of this kind of a common root. And Bueller mentions the example of the incest taboo and references Durham that maybe later Trent will say something about that. But like that's the basic idea there that the traits can be locally refined variations of the same on the same ancestral theme. Lastly, um, genetic drift, which is just like basically just errors, like errors happen. It's not a kind of a clear cut process. And genetic drift to fixation, meaning that a genetic drift becoming becoming a dominant um, part of a group of people, is actually very likely in the small groups, right? Um, it's just like reminds me about the chapter of the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman about the law of small numbers, right? That like as a matter of a critical thinking fact, Kahneman mentions that people who say that um, small towns are the places with the most poverty um, numbers in the U.S. And another like study says small towns are on top of and the list of most educated counties in the whole of United States. And then people are just gonna go and study small villages to see like what is going on. But Common says there's no causal story. That's just about a small sample. Just like, if you um, flip a coin 5 times, is far more likely that you might see something really weird, 4 heads and 1 tail, than if you just randomly do that for like 1 billion times, right? The point being that when there is a drift in a small population, that a small excessive things could happen um, really fast in those small populations. That these kind of genetic drifts could kind of converge, and before there is a population explosion, you have gotten this genetic configuration within that population that is just very, um, you know, uniformly shows a trait. That doesn't mean that was an adaptation, right? There are other evolutionary causes for cultural universals, you know? But because, according to Buehler, evolutionary psychologists are as obsessed as natural theologians with finding some sort of a complex design, they give some sort of a privileged position to adaptations. There are all sorts of things that happens in evolution. And all of those things could lead to cultural universals, right? So cultural universals um, could have sources other than adaptations, and they could be there because of non psychological in the universals and the evolutionary psychologists want to talk about causes. Trent?
Yes, I think on top of what you said, Bueller's critique is not just the cultural universals that are explained by psychological universals. It's all universals might not have a cause or teleology behind. They may not serve a specific function for the survival of well-being of a human population. Hence, for instance, when Tubi sees, say, incest taboo, it's just demonstrated in, say, 98% of human societies. And of course, the 2% are weirdos or they forgot about that taboo, whatever. But what is important is the norm is there's incest taboo. Then we try to explain that from the like adaptations point of view. But Doran's research points out something really interesting that those vast majority of the societies with incest taboo all trace their genealogy back to a very small group of people, like tribes at a certain point of the evolution. So it might be happenstance. And the fact that the groups survived were not reduced both to the fact that they possessed the incest taboo, it might be a flood that destroyed their rival groups. Those are things that were lost to we cannot observe the untold story. Therefore, we suffer a terrible survivor's bias by first of all attributing universality to a statistically widely distributed trait, then by connecting that observation with hypothetical psychological mechanism. And finally, giving that hypothetical psychological um, mechanism the cause of explaining that species successful reproduction. So it's these layers of hypotheses that add on to the extent that at the end we got something really, really far away from what we really have. What we have is we observe that 98% of, say, human groups observe incest taboo, but that does not tell us that observing incest taboo was quintessential in the history of human evolution because it helps human beings to better solve the specific adaptive problem, and human groups with other strategies to say they tolerate a certain degree of incest marriage or reproduction were outcompeted. No, they might not be outcompeted at all. It's just a happenstance we have this situation. It's natural theology saying we see certain thing and we through back engineering we come up with a very complicated sequence of inference, and then we say, oh, there is a reason to everything that ever exists. I think that's the whole like picture why David Buehler thinks it's very, very misleading to jump from certain observed statistic pattern to a comprehensive theory to everything, which evolutionist psychologists are providing here. Yes.
Yes, I think that's also a very important point that you mentioned that, and I think I will say this, and if you don't have anything to add, we can come to a closure for this episode, which is just like exactly the point about like everything happens for a reason kind of an attitude, right? And I think in the sense of like, all the alpha males in a community just were out like in a ceremony like only reserved for the alpha males, and there was like a thunderstorm and they just drowned, and like then under the new conditions, the evolution doesn't have any kind of information that like, oh, the alpha males, now we need to bring them back. Now the evolution has a new population and has a new pressure, and like now for instance it could go a very different way of what to save and what not to save, right? And that may not like really resemble like the past selections that have happened. So basically, not everything happens for a reason, and major things may not be happening for a reason in the way that evolutionary psychology wants them to happen. At least that's what Buehler is arguing for. Trent?
Yeah, that's essentially what I was going to say. Yes. And I think with that said, we can bring this episode to closure. And dear listener, thanks for paying attention to us and stay tuned. Bueller's the challenge of the elephant in the room, human nature, is coming up.